Okay, if you like crits in Warframe, you know, big red numbers, make your monkey brain do all the good chemicals and stuff, then right now is your time to shine. Because with the recent update came one Augment Mod that allows us to crank crits up beyond 11 all the way up to 12. I'm serious. So, in this video, I want to have a little bit of silly fun and see how far we could push this crit madness on the two crit kings of Warframe, Harrow and Kullervo. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now let's get to it. Now, first of all, a very quick recap in case you missed yesterday's video discussing the new augments. What we're going to talk about today is the mod Tharros Lethality. This is an augment mod for Styanax's skill Tharros Strike, which was introduced with the Valis Undermined update last week. First of all, what the base skill Tharros Strike does is very straightforward. Enemies in a cone in front of you will have their armor and shields reduced, with the kicker being that Tharros Strike is Styanax's helmet ability, so you can put that onto any other Warframe. Now, the augment mod Tharros Lethality now makes it that, against those enemies that you hit with Tharros Strike, you will have increased crit damage. At base, this is 100%, but it scales with ability strength, so if you go for a high strength build, then you can easily have a crit damage bonus of over 300% from just this mod alone. So I think you can see why this can get pretty broken, especially if we were to, let's say, infuse Tharros Strike on Warframes that are very crit heavy. And that is exactly what we're gonna do right now. But yeah, so much for the augment itself. Let's next actually talk about how we can incorporate it into our builds. Now, of course, Harrow and Kullervo are not the only crit-heavy frames in the game. There are others, for example, Yareli for pistols is pretty good. There are also certain augments that give crit chance, for example for Nidus, that will be an option too. Just saying, for the sake of this video, we're gonna stick with only Kullervo and Revenant. As for the builds themselves, depending on how you set up your personal Warframe, there might be some changes if you want to incorporate Tharros Lethality, because you gotta tweak the build in a way that it works nicely with Tharros Strike, is what I mean. First of all, the main priority of our builds is naturally strength, because the more strength we have, the bigger the crit damage buff of Tharros Lethality becomes. However, and this is very important, that strength should not come at the expense of range and duration. Range, very simple. Tharros Strike only has a base range of 9 meters, so you want to have at least 100% ability range, you don't want to get negative. And then for the duration, yes, the armor reduction from Tharros Strike is permanent, however, the crit damage buff from Tharros Lethality does have a duration, so also here you ideally want to have somewhat between 100 and 150% ability duration, just to make sure that you can actually get around to taking out all the enemies before the buff runs out. As for the builds themselves, how about we start out with melee guy Kullervo, and for the helmet option, of course, it's a no-brainer, we go with Tharros Strike, Tharros Lethality, so we can skip over that right away. In the Archon shards though, I went a little bit very into crit, with 4 purple ones that all give us 25% more melee critical damage, doubles if the maximum energy is over 500, which, as we see here, it is, so each and every one of those shards gives us plus 50% crit damage. This crit damage value is additive to crit damage mods, but if you wanted to go really all in, of course you could also go with the Tau Forged ones, but genuinely I did not want to do that much investment. Also, I did one casting speed shard for the Tharros Strike, making it a bit more convenient, but if you wanted to have the utmost crazy numbers, you would go 5 Tau Forged purple ones here. Now, this right here would be the Kullervo build that you saw in the background. We focus mainly on ability strength with Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, Umbral Intensify, Mold Augmented, and Growing Power in the Aura. I mean, right now the strength numbers only represent whatever we have modded onto here. If you factor in a maxed out Mold Augmented plus Growing Power active, then this right here would be plus 85% on top, so we're talking about 383% ability strength when this build is at its maximum capabilities. Now, one more thing to say about the strength here. If you wanted to, you could replace Umbral Intensify with Precision Intensify to, instead of giving 44% to all the abilities, just give 90 whopping % to Tharros Strike itself for even more crit damage. That would be viable. But I'm personally not a fan of it because that means we lose that ability strength on our crit chance from Wrathful Advance right here, and also we wouldn't get that much overguard because, less strength here means lower overguard cap. Let's also quickly take a look at the augments. Of course, Tharros Lethality is a must and will be present on all builds today, but for Kullervo in specific, I love Volatile Recompense. This is your AAA ultimate survivability mod. Actually, I cannot even imagine playing Kullervo without it anymore. I think most of you feel the same way about it. It's just absolutely awesome. But if for whatever reason you rather want to play him without overguard fully into health tanking, you do you. Just, this is my absolute favorite here, which is also why we go with Arcane Truculence, because this one helps us viral prime all the enemies around us pretty much completely passively. Now, with this build, unfortunately, we can't even see on screen how ridiculously strong it is, because the maximum crit tier that Warframe can even display is tier 3 red crit with 3 exclamation marks. Tiers above that are still being calculated, but you don't get more exclamation marks on screen. So, just for the fun of it, let's actually calculate how ridiculous this Kullervo build gets. First of all, just the weapon by itself. For testing purposes, I went with the Hate. I didn't use any crit Incarnate evolutions, so what we're having here is a base 30% crit chance and 2.5 times crit damage multiplier. As crit mods, we use Blood Rush as well as Galvanized Steel, which at maximum combo multiplier gives us around plus 500% crit chance. We're gonna keep it at flat values for the sake of simplicity, so that would put us at a total of 180% crit chance just from mods alone. But that's of course not it, because we have Wrathful Advance at 383% ability strength, which means on top of the 180% crit chance, we get 766% flat on top, leaving us with a final crit chance of 946%. So we're talking about tier 6, tier 7 red crits. Now let's talk about the crit damage. Also here, on the weapon, we have Galvanized Steel for plus 120% crit damage, but remember we also have 4 purple Archon shards, giving us another plus 200%, bringing that up to 320, and now is the moment where we get Tharros Lethality into the mix, the augment for Tharros Strike, at 383%, meaning that will be another 383 on top, giving us a total of plus 703% crit damage at the base of 2.5x that we have. That would mean our Hate will end up with a crit damage multiplier of round about 20x. And remind you, that's for a yellow crit. We are dealing tier 6, tier 7 red crits, so you'd have to multiply the 20x by 8 or 9 times. And yes, if you wanted to, you could theoretically also use external crit damage sources like Arcane Crepuscular or Tenacious Bond, but to be honest, with such a ridiculously high crit damage multiplier, really doesn't make all too much of a difference anymore. So yeah, as you can see, Kullervo was already beyond good and evil. Let's also talk about Harrow, but here I'm gonna keep the build a little bit shorter. We skip the helmet section again, quick look at the Archon shards, nothing that would really influence the damage numbers of our build, just, whatever I'm personally going with on my Harrow. And this right here is the build for Tharros Lethality. It's a little bit of a shield tanking focus here with adaptation and primed redirection. If you wanted to, you could go for shield gating too, because Harrow with his first ability is tailor-made for that. However, the only somewhat difficult question here is, which skill do you replace with Tharros Strike? Because honestly, the third one, giving you tons of energy, is really convenient to have, but then the first one is also pretty good for survivability and crowd controlling the enemies. The two, you kind of sort of need that because it gives you a lot of fire rate and reload speed, and of course the 4 you also don't want to miss it. I personally decided to go over the 3 because you can give yourself a lot of energy back with Equilibrium and a companion that showers you in health orbs. If you wanted to though, if you feel comfortable this way, you could also replace the first one. That is down to personal preference. For the build itself though, also here I tried to focus on as much strength as possible, which is a little bit of a problem on Harrow sometimes, because usually Harrow does not need all too much ability strength, as your 4th ability is capped anyway. So I think overall I did a pretty decent mix of everything. Of course, Tharros Lethality has to be here, and for me personally, it's also a must-have to go for Lasting Covenant because it makes it so super duper freaking convenient to never have to recast this skill here. Very nice, but I know not everybody loves it, so if you don't like it, just replace it with something else. Also here, if this build is fully maxed out, we're talking about another 25% from Growing Power and 60% from Mold Augmented, which would end us up at 328% maximum ability strength here. Also here, for the pure fun of it, let's talk numbers. As an example, we're gonna equip Harrow with the Burst on Prime Incarnon. With the right evolutions, you're going to be looking at a base of 50% crit chance and a 3x crit damage multiplier, meaning if we think conservatively and we only use critical delay as crit chance mod, then that would mean we're at a total of 150% crit chance on the weapon. And then on top of that, we would get 200% final crit chance from Harrow, or at least if you hit a headshot, otherwise it's 50% final crit chance. So at max, we're looking at 350% crit chance on headshots, and that is if you don't factor in galvanized scope or maybe even primary acuity. That would completely blow the ball out of the park, but then again, I don't think most people would use that on a Burst on Prime Incarnon, so to keep it a bit more realistic here, let's just go with only 350% crit chance. Next, let's also talk about the crit damage here, where I'm conservatively gonna assume we only mod Vital Sense onto the weapon. But then again, with Tharros Lethality and 328% ability strength, that means on top of the 120% from Vital Sense, we're gonna get 328%, bringing our total crit damage bonus to 448%, which means at a base crit damage multiplier of 3x, that would increase it to a total of 16.44 times. And again, that's at a yellow crit, but we are tier 1 and tier 2 red critting, so multiply that by 3 to 4 times. So yeah, that's pretty ridiculous. Of course, this is complete overkill. Nobody in the world will ever need that much damage, specifically given the fact that Tharros Strike already reduces enemy defenses down to 0. But hey, big numbers are fun, especially if you crank them up so high that the game itself can't even display it anymore. And if you want to know everything about the other 3 new augments, then you can find my overview on these right here. Another massive shoutout to Niels V, Demonoid Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostalix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Undercaneo2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Helantaris, Patrasator, Boomia1, Zave, Arwindai, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.